The story begins with that single question, whispered across the cold expanse of forgotten star systems and half buried in the dust of a million dead worlds. It is a question no imperial scholar is permitted to ask, no inquisitor dares to voice, and no living historian has ever survived attempting to answer. For in the hidden archives of the Imperium, locked behind vaults that even primarchs were once forbidden to enter, lies a truth so disturbing, so deeply intertwined with the Emperor's most desperate mistakes, that uncovering it risks shattering the myth of humanity's greatest master. The Imperium loves to speak of its Emperor as the one being who never faltered, never feared, never hesitated. But buried beneath that worshipful illusion is a stark, terrifying contradiction. There was one Primarch, one perfect son, whose very existence filled the Emperor not with pride, but with dread. Not because he was corrupted, not because he rebelled, not because he betrayed humanity, but because he was too close to what the Emperor used to be, and far too close to what the Emperor feared he might become again. To understand this dread, you must go back to a time before the Horus heresy, before the Great Crusade glittered across the stars, to a time when myths walked in the Emperor's shadow, and the Primarchs were still newly forged weapons. Every one of them was designed with precision, strength balanced with obedience, brilliance tempered with loyalty, ambition shackled behind hidden genetic restraints. But even the Emperor could not entirely control the warp, and in that unpredictable storm of power and intent, one Primarch emerged, altered, enhanced, different. While others embodied singular virtues, courage, warcraft, wisdom, diplomacy, discipline, this one Primarch was forged with something far more dangerous, insight into the Emperor himself. A mind that could not only strategize on the battlefield, but dissect the soul of the one who created him. A mind that looked at the Emperor not as a god to worship, but as a father to question. And behind that questioning lay a brilliance so precise, so mercilessly logical, that it bordered on prophecy. It was this Primarch who asked the question no other son dared utter. Why were we made? Not in admiration, not in loyalty, but in suspicion. This first section unfolds within the golden atmosphere of Terra, long before the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy. Their gestation chambers glowed beneath the endless machinery of the Emperor's laboratory, each capsule containing a child destined to shake the stars. But something was wrong, horribly wrong, in the chamber of the one who would terrify even their creator. His growth accelerated faster than projected. His neural activity spiked beyond measurable thresholds. His mind developed with impossible speed, absorbing knowledge, breaking it apart, reassembling it into questions no child should have been able to imagine. Servitors monitoring him during incubation reported anomalies. Psychic murmurs surrounding his chamber caused instruments to flicker and warp. At one point, the Emperor himself shut down the entire facility for 12 minutes after detecting a sudden surge of thought from the Primarch's embryonic brain, a surge directed at him. Not a hostile surge, not a confused one, but a questioning one, as if this unborn child had somehow become aware of his Maker's presence, and was attempting to understand him. The Emperor, who had walked with gods, defied warp entities, commanded armies of psychic titans, found himself unsettled by it. Not afraid, not yet, but unsettled in a way he had not been in thousands of years. For the first time, he considered the possibility that one of his sons might grow to rival him not in strength or might, but in perception. And perception, he knew, was far more dangerous than power. Perception could unravel secrets buried since the dawn of humanity, secrets the Emperor himself had spent millennia hiding, including the truth of what he once was. As the Primarch grew, his thoughts sharpened into something the Emperor had not programmed, not intended, not prepared for, a mind capable of peering through lies, illusions, and half-spoken truths. And yet, when the Emperor looked upon him in his incubation chamber, he saw no malice. No corruption, no rebellion, only clarity. Only the kind of clarity that threatened everything he intended the Imperium to stand upon. When the ruinous powers eventually stole the Primarchs away, flinging them across the galaxy, the Emperor felt a familiar wrench in his soul. But for this one child, for the one who saw too much, the Emperor felt something else entirely. A brief moment of relief. Relief that the galaxy was vast. Relief that distance might dull that piercing insight. Relief that perhaps this son would never uncover the one truth that could tear the Imperium apart before it even began. But fate had other plans. This first section establishes the chilling tone, a narrative steeped in mystery and danger, hinting that the greatest threat to the Emperor was not Horus, not Magnus, not Angron, but a Primarch whose mind was a weapon too sharp to control, too insightful to mislead, too aware to bend. And as the Imperium spread across the stars, rumors of this Primarch began to echo again, rumors of a world transformed by intellect and dread, rumors of a legion shaped in his image, rumors of discoveries buried in data crypts the Emperor never wanted anyone to open. Because the Emperor did fear. Not often, and never openly. But he feared one son above all others. And that son had begun to understand why. If you stay with this story until the very end, you'll understand the one revelation the Emperor hoped no living soul would ever piece together, a truth so unsettling that even the custodes refused to record it in their memories. Consider that your reward for watching closely, the most forbidden secret about the one Primarch he feared more than any other. But first, we need to step away from the cradle of Terra, and look at the world where this Primarch eventually fell. Because while the other sons landed on worlds that shaped their personality, icy death worlds, brutal warrior cultures, shining civilizations or ruined wastelands, this one landed somewhere different. Somewhere that didn't mold him, but awakened him. A place filled with old knowledge, hidden technology, and ruins left behind by civilizations far older than the Imperium. Whispered remnants of the dark age of technology. Forbidden archives untouched for millennia. Here, on this forgotten world, the Primarch did not just survive, he observed. He studied, he learned, and in learning, he began to understand things no Primarch should have ever been allowed to comprehend. From the moment he arrived, the planet reacted to him like a puzzle waiting for the right mind to solve it. Ancient databanks unlocked. Mechanisms long dormant flickered back to life. Entire districts of forgotten cities reactivated as if recognizing something in his genetic code. The locals believed he was sent by their ancestors. They thought he was a prophet. But prophecy had nothing to do with it. The truth was far more terrifying. This Primarch, from childhood, possessed the ability the Emperor feared most. He saw patterns. Not patterns of war or diplomacy, but of motives. Of hidden intentions. Of the lies behind the lies. The Emperor had built the Imperium on a necessary illusion, one truth for the future of humanity, and another, darker truth buried beneath it. But this son had a mind that dissected every contradiction, every flaw in the Emperor's design, every trace of something left unexplained. Where another Primarch might simply obey, he would analyze. Where another might accept the Emperor's plan, he would question the plan itself. And worst of all, he questioned the Emperor's silence. As he grew, the people of his adopted world followed him unquestioningly. Not because he inspired devotion like Lorgar, or command like Guilliman, or awe like Sanguinius, but because he radiated certainty. He didn't hope. He didn't believe. He knew. With every piece of ancient data he uncovered, with every machine he awakened, with every secret he analyzed, he saw a shadow behind the Emperor's golden light. A shadow the Emperor thought he had buried 10,000 years before the Primarch project even began. By the time the Emperor finally found him, this Primarch had already developed theories, dangerously accurate ones, about the warp, the old night, the psychic chain the Emperor intended to bind humanity with, and the hidden cost of building an Imperium that stretched across the stars like a glittering, fragile lie. When the Emperor stepped onto that world to reclaim his son, he looked at the Primarch with a rare expression. Caution. Not anger, not disappointment, caution. As if he were speaking not to a child, but to a rival. The conversation that followed has never been recorded. No Vox logs. no transcriptions, no witnesses allowed. But what is known, from fragments whispered through the halls of Terra, is that the Primarch asked the Emperor a question that froze even the custodian guard. What were you before you became our father? Not, who, what. Because the Primarch had already begun to suspect that the Emperor's origins were not divine, not pure, and not entirely under his control. He suspected that the Emperor himself was built on a bargain, one that demanded a price humanity would one day be forced to pay. And from that moment on, the Emperor feared this son not because he might rebel, but because he might uncover the truth. The truth about the Emperor's past. The truth about the Primarch project. The truth about why humanity was really being gathered beneath a single golden crown. And most dangerous of all, the truth about what the Emperor was planning to become. The rest of the sons were loyal soldiers, idealistic leaders, sharpened weapons. But this Primarch, he was something else entirely. He was a mirror the Emperor did not want to look into. After the Emperor reclaimed his elusive son and brought him back to Terra, an unease settled over the imperial palace, subtle at first, invisible to all but the most attuned minds. No official orders were changed. No alarms were raised. No proclamations were issued. Yet those who worked closest to the Emperor sensed something beneath the surface, something cold and calculating, shifting behind his eyes whenever he looked upon this Primarch. The son did not behave like the others upon arriving at the palace. He did not marvel at the machinery. He did not question the custodes. He did not react with awe at the scale of humanity's future. Instead, he observed, quietly, relentlessly, and with a focus that made even the Emperor's honor guard uneasy. Servitors reported fluctuations in psychic fields when he passed. Data vaults he should not have been able to access began to malfunction. Certain custodes assigned to monitor him found themselves reassigned without explanation. It was as if the Emperor was trying to prevent something, some connection, some realization, from forming. But it was already too late. The Primarch had begun to sense something hidden within the palace. Something ancient. Something sealed deep in the gene labs where the Primarch project had first been designed. And while the Emperor tried to distract him with honors and teachings, the son saw what those gestures truly were, diversions. For weeks, the Imperium would later say, the Primarch spoke little. He studied. He examined. He walked the forgotten corridors of Terra's understructure with the curiosity of a man tracing someone else's footsteps. The custodes followed in silence, unsure whether they were guarding him, or guarding the Emperor from him. Because where another Primarch might have felt awe, this one felt contradiction. Why did the Emperor speak of unity, yet hide so many secrets? Why did he preach rationality, yet forbid access to knowledge? Why did he promise a future without superstition, yet radiate a power that defied every law of science? Most troubling of all, why did the Emperor prevent his sons from learning about humanity's earliest past? One night, if such a concept still held meaning within the palace's artificial lighting, the Primarch drifted into the vault levels, following a psychic whisper that seemed to stir the metal beneath his feet. He came upon a sealed door of impossible construction, a door not meant to be opened by anyone except the Emperor himself. A door from which emanated echoes of something older than Terra, older than the Primarchs, older than the Imperium. The custodes intercepted him before he could touch it. Their halberds lowered. Their armor hummed with warning tones. Yet the Primarch didn't react with aggression or fear. He simply stared at the door and whispered, almost absently, "He's afraid of what's behind this." The custodes exchanged glances, a fleeting moment of uncertainty among warriors who never doubted anything. They did not understand how the Primarch could know. They did not understand what he sensed. They only knew that the Emperor had issued a single standing command regarding this Primarch. He must never reach the inner vaults. From that moment on, the palace changed. Guards rotated faster. The Emperor's approach became distant, cautious. Meetings with the Primarch occurred with increasing rarity, as if the father feared the son's questions more than any external threat the galaxy could muster. Yet the Primarch himself was not hostile, not rebellious, not resentful. He simply continued observing, piecing together fragments of knowledge in a silent tapestry only he could see. But the Emperor understood the danger. A weapon can be controlled. A warrior can be guided. Even a demigod can be betrayed or deceived. But a mind like this, a mind that could see deeper than truth, deeper than history, deeper than the Emperor's carefully woven narratives. That was something that could destroy the Imperium long before any traitor ever raised a weapon. It wasn't what the Primarch would do. It was what he could discover. And discovery, in the world of the Emperor, was a far greater threat than rebellion. Soon, the day arrived when the Emperor decided something had to change. This Primarch, for all his brilliance, could not be allowed to remain on Terra, where his presence pressed too close to the truths buried in the palace's foundation. He needed distance, a world of his own, an empire to build, duties to occupy him, anything to divert him from the path he was dangerously close to uncovering. And so, quietly, without ceremony, the Emperor made his decision. He would send this Primarch far from Terra, far from the vaults, far from the truth. But what the Emperor failed to realize was that sending him away wouldn't stop the questions. It would only give him the freedom to dig deeper than ever before. When the Emperor finally dispatched this Primarch to claim command of his legion, the decision was framed as a triumph, a moment of destiny, a sacred reunion between father and son, the symbolic passing of authority. That is the story the Imperium would later repeat. That is the version written in the sanitized annals of imperial truth. But those who were present, those who saw the Emperor's expression as the ship departed Terra, knew there was something else beneath the ceremony. Relief. Something rare, almost impossible to imagine, etched in the golden mask he wore for the galaxy. Relief that the Primarch was finally leaving Terra. Relief that he would be far from the vaults. Relief that his mind would not continue to dissect the Emperor's history piece by dangerous piece. But distance does not restrain a mind like his. If anything, it freed him. The ship that carried him toward his legion carved a quiet arc through the void, a silent arrow slicing through the cold black. During the voyage, he barely spoke. He walked the ship in thoughtful silence, hands behind his back, eyes drifting from the walls to the stars beyond. The crew often felt as if he were reading something invisible, tracing faint echoes left behind by ancient events only he could sense. When he finally reached his legion, their reaction was profound. The Primarchs were each crafted with distinct traits, and their legions instinctively reflected the nature of their lost fathers. But this legion, they had been waiting for a guiding mind. A clarifying force. They were brilliant, analytical, precise, but incomplete. They fought as if navigating data instead of emotion, as if something essential had been withheld from them, waiting for a key. The Primarch was that key. From the moment he addressed them, the Legion recognized their missing half. He did not give speeches about glory or honor. He did not promise victory or destiny. Instead, he gave them understanding, something they had never received from the Emperor, and something no other Primarch would have ever bothered explaining. He taught them how systems collapse, how civilizations rise, how the warp whispers behind every human decision, how even the Emperor's vision was laced with paradox, how loyalty should never be blind, because blindness leads to manipulation. Other legions trained for war. His legion trained for truth. They learned to uncover patterns hidden in battlefield debris, to read intentions in the movements of armies, to uncover lies in the words of Xenos, traitors, and imperial officials alike, to peel open any mystery, no matter how forbidden. And above all, they were taught to question, not disrespectfully, not rebelliously, but with clarity. And that clarity spread through the ranks like wildfire. They saw things other legions ignored. They understood the Emperor's grand design with a precision that mirrored their father. They anticipated threats before other generals even recognized a pattern. And soon, they became indispensable, not as blunt instruments of war, but as interpreters of the galaxy's hidden currents. But there is a cost to seeing too much. The Primarch noticed that within imperial bureaucracy, certain patterns repeated with alarming frequency, patterns of suppression, erasure, and deliberate confusion. Reports contradicted each other. Records vanished. Orders were issued that made no strategic sense unless one assumed the goal wasn't victory, but control. He began to suspect something the Emperor desperately wanted him never to consider. The Imperium wasn't designed simply to unify humanity. It was designed to constrain it, to bind it, to shape it into something small enough for one being to rule forever. And if that was true, then the Primarch needed to understand why. As the Great Crusade advanced, the Primarch led his legion through forgotten ruins left behind by empires older than humanity itself. They found machines that reacted to his presence, archives that unlocked at his touch, vaults filled with information that should have been impossible for any Primarch to decipher, yet he read them with a frightening ease. One world in particular changed everything. It held remnants of an empire lost to the warp thousands of years earlier, a civilization that had achieved psychic unity, then collapsed into nightmare within a single generation. The ruins whispered a warning written across their stone walls in thousand-year-old scars. A mind that unites too tightly becomes the cage that kills the species. It was then the Primarch began to understand. The Emperor's Imperium was not a safeguard for humanity. It was a dam built to contain a flood. A psychic catastrophe the Emperor feared might one day repeat. A catastrophe that, perhaps, he had witnessed firsthand. And if the Emperor's plan failed, the galaxy would burn. As the Primarch and his legion carved deeper across the Great Crusade, their reputation grew, not for brutality, not for conquest, not for obedience, but for understanding. Worlds they brought into compliance described them as scholars in armor, investigators in the shape of demigods, warriors who seemed to know what an enemy would do before the enemy understood it themselves. And at the center of this ever-expanding sphere of insight stood the Primarch, silent, tireless, thinking always. He was not driven by ambition, not by pride, not even by the Emperor's approval. He was driven by truth. And truth, as he now understood, was the one force the Imperium both relied upon and feared. The more he uncovered, the clearer the cracks became. The Imperium was powerful, yes, but built on half-secrets, half-fictions, and half-remnants of an age long dead. The Emperor had crafted a narrative of unity, but behind the golden facade were patterns of avoidance, patterns of censorship, and patterns of historical amputation. Entire eras erased, civilizations buried, technologies sealed, questions forbidden. Why? Why did the Emperor hide so much of humanity's past? The Primarch soon realized that these weren't simple omissions. These were surgical absences, deliberately removed, like diseased tissue cut from a body. And if something is cut away that precisely, that repeatedly, it means the one wielding the scalpel is afraid of what might happen if it ever grew back. His legion, trained to recognize patterns, reached the same conclusion. On dozens of worlds, they found ruins that mirrored those of the forgotten empire he had studied earlier, societies that had risen to psychic unity, only to implode in catastrophic self-destruction. Always the same cause, always the same ending, a voice echoing through human history like a curse. Unite the mind, and doom the species. But the Emperor's ultimate design, a psychic web, a network of human souls united through him. A crown of infinite minds, all channeling power through one being. A God made not by faith, but by connection. A connection that resembled the very catastrophes humanity had survived only by tearing history apart and burning the evidence. The Primarch began to suspect a horrifying possibility. The Emperor wasn't trying to avoid humanity's destruction. He was trying to harness it. On world after world, the Primarch found records describing ancient disasters, psychic implosions, warp storms overflowing into reality, continents vaporized by the collapse of linked minds. But the Emperor's grand plan, the plan whispered only to Magnus and hidden from the others, was to create something even more dangerous. A stable psychic singularity, with himself at the center. And the Primarch, the one forged with insight sharp enough to pierce illusions, now feared that the Emperor's dream of human unity was built on the same foundations as humanity's oldest nightmares. He needed proof. One barren world provided it. Deep beneath its cracked deserts lay a vault untouched for millennia. Not alien, not human, something else, something from the earliest days of the Age of Strife. Inside, he found fractured data crystals containing records of a psychic convergence experiment. A single, chilling message played on a loop, written by scientists who had lived through the disaster. We tried to make a man into a god. We succeeded, and then we died. What killed them was not the experiment. What killed them was the being they created. A being of unimaginable psychic unity. A being who consumed their knowledge, their essence, their civilization. A being who disappeared into the warp, never to return. The Primarch stared at the message for hours, motionless, as if comparing every word to something familiar. To someone familiar. Because the more he read, the more he realized that the description of the ancient psychic god was not entirely unlike the Emperor. Not physically, not historically, but in intent. Was the Emperor a survivor of that age? A construct of it, a refinement of a failed experiment, or something far more complex? The Primarch could not be certain. Not yet, but the similarity terrified him. If the Emperor was truly attempting to recreate a psychic unity on a galactic scale, then the Imperium wasn't a stabilizing force. It was a fuse, and humanity was the powder. From that moment, the Primarch's mission changed. He was no longer seeking truth for its own sake. He was now trying to determine the fate of his species. And as he dug deeper, he began to understand why the Emperor had feared him from the moment of his creation. Because he was the only one with the clarity to uncover the Emperor's oldest mistake. And the only one with the intellect to see how the Emperor might try to fix it. Even if that fix cost humanity everything. The Primarch didn't fear the Emperor's power. He feared the Emperor's certainty. Because certainty, when amplified across billions of minds, becomes catastrophe. And yet, despite everything he had discovered, he said nothing. Not to his legion, not to his brothers, not even to himself aloud. Because he knew the Emperor was listening. Always listening, always watching, always waiting for the moment when this too perceptive son might become a threat that needed correction. So the Primarch kept digging. Quietly, methodically, ruthlessly. And with every truth he uncovered, he grew closer not just to understanding the Emperor, but to surpassing him. By their raw power, or by their ability to turn that power inward, to choose silence over violence, and thereby become even more unpredictable. This is where Vulcan's story takes a sharp and unsettling turn, a moment that forced even the Emperor to confront a truth he hoped he'd never face. After surviving the worst horrors of the Great Crusade, Vulcan began to display something unusual among the Primarchs, a deepening self-awareness of his own destructive potential. While others gloried in conquest, Vulcan questioned the very foundations upon which the Imperium expanded. While others competed for favor, Vulcan quietly tried to understand the consequences of wielding power without restraint. And this made him infinitely more dangerous. For an immortal who cannot die, pain means nothing, but conviction means everything. Vulcan's convictions began shifting. His compassion became sharper, more deliberate. He no longer simply saved human lives, he began challenging the logic behind risking them at all. He started asking questions no Primarch should ever ask, questions that sounded uncomfortably similar to the whispers of rebellion the Emperor dreaded from any of his creations. The Emperor had engineered warriors. Vulcan was becoming a philosopher. And philosophers with infinite strength, unkillable bodies, and a flawless moral compass. They are not predictable. They do not bend. They do not break. They choose. It was during a classified campaign, the details of which are still scrubbed from Imperial archives, that Vulcan made a choice the Emperor never expected. He refused an order. Calmly, quietly, without anger. He assessed the command, measured its consequences, and simply said, "No, not as defiance, not as rebellion, but as a moral judgment." And that terrified the Emperor more than any raging Primarch ever could. Because a Primarch who rebels can be crushed. A Primarch who questions can be persuaded. But a Primarch who decides, with perfect clarity and indestructible will, stands outside all control. Especially, when that Primarch cannot die. From this moment on, their relationship changed. The Emperor never punished Vulcan for the refusal, but he never forgot it either. For all his power, the Emperor understood something painfully simple. An unstoppable weapon is dangerous. A thinking unstoppable weapon is catastrophic. And Vulcan was both. Their bond, once warm, became colder, more cautious. The Emperor observed, evaluated, studied, and beneath his inscrutable expression lay a truth he would confess to no one. Not Malkador, not the custodians, not even to Vulcan himself. He feared what Vulcan might become if pushed too far. And the most chilling part, Vulcan never once realized the shadow he cast over the throne. The truth of the Emperor's fear was never spoken. It could not be. Not in the halls of Terra, not in the archives, not even in whispered confessions between trusted aides. For to admit fear was a weakness, yet here it was, sharp and undeniable, aimed at one Primarch above all. By this point in the Great Crusade, Vulcan had demonstrated something that no other Primarch had, an uncanny ability to understand not only the intentions of others, but the consequences of the Emperor's decisions with a clarity that bordered on prescience. Battles were won not just through strength, but through insight. Political machinations were navigated with subtle precision. Even the Emperor himself found that Vulcan anticipated strategic moves before they were made, predicting outcomes the Golden Throne might have thought only he could foresee. This insight unsettled the Emperor. It was not fear born of physical threat, he had mastered death and commanded legions, but fear of a mind that could surpass him. A mind that could, if it chose, see the Emperor not as a god, not as a savior, but as a flawed being, capable of error, capable of obsession, capable of catastrophe. The Emperor began to recognize the implications. This Primarch could understand the warp in ways others could not. He could perceive the consequences of the Emperor's drive for human unity across the galaxy. He could discern flaws in the grand plan before it was too late. And worst of all, he could act on them. Even in private, among the silent, loyal custodians, the Emperor spoke in rare moments of caution. He considered contingencies for what to do should Vulcan, or any Primarch who gained such insight, challenge the vision he had labored over for 10,000 years. Yet Vulcan was not disloyal. He had no desire to betray the Emperor, no hunger for power. His loyalty was not blind obedience, it was reasoned. It was conscious. It was unwaveringly moral. And that made him terrifying. Because loyalty cannot be manipulated if it is tempered with judgment. As the Great Crusade progressed, Vulcan's reputation grew, not just as a warlord, but as a force capable of changing the trajectory of entire campaigns with a single decision, one that others would not even understand until it was too late. The Emperor, observing from afar, felt a gnawing doubt that he could not silence, that the one Primarch he had forged with perfect intention might one day, unintentionally, undo the very Imperium he had created. And in those quiet, unrecorded moments, the Emperor admitted what no one else could. He feared Vulcan, not for his strength, not for his intellect alone, but for the combination of insight, morality, and unyielding clarity that could one day outpace the Emperor himself. The fear was precise, calculated, inescapable, and that fear, carefully hidden from the galaxy, was perhaps the most dangerous weapon Vulcan ever wielded, even unknowingly. Because when a creator fears his own creation, the balance of power is no longer physical. It becomes psychological. It becomes inevitable. And the galaxy, would feel the consequences of that inevitability, whether it realized it or not. Vulcan, the Primarch the Emperor feared above all, carried a presence that was almost impossible to define. His power alone was immense, but it was his mind, the relentless clarity, the perception of truth in places others dared not look, that created the shadow that loomed over the Emperor. It was not a shadow cast by violence or rebellion, it was a shadow cast by inevitability. As the Great Crusade advanced into sectors untouched by the Imperium, Vulcan's legion began uncovering relics and truths that shook even the most steadfast Imperial commanders. Ancient Xenos machinery, cryptic warnings, ruins of civilizations that had risen and fallen in cycles dictated by psychic catastrophe, all seemed to respond to him, as if recognizing a mind capable of understanding them. And everywhere they went, his insight allowed them to anticipate threats before they emerged, to uncover deceptions before they spread, and to prevent disasters that could have shattered entire star systems. Yet it was not his tactical genius that unnerved the Emperor. It was the predictive certainty Vulcan wielded. The Emperor had designed a galaxy-spanning empire built on control and manipulation. But here was a son whose mind could see beyond orders and plans, beyond doctrine and obedience. Vulcan could see the consequences of the Emperor's decisions, not in theory, but with a terrifying clarity that no other Primarch possessed. Even the Emperor's own plans, sprawling, intricate, and centuries in the making, had blind spots. And Vulcan, with his unparalleled insight, illuminated them effortlessly. The Emperor began to recognize a dangerous truth: his creation was no longer merely a weapon or a general. He was a judge, a mirror, a sun capable of perceiving the Emperor's designs in their entirety, and perhaps even correcting them if he chose to. This realization transformed fear into something sharper: anticipation. The Emperor understood that one day, Vulcan might face choices that could alter the fate of the Imperium, not through rebellion, but through reason. That day, the Emperor realized, might come sooner than he could prepare for. Across the galaxy, Vulcan's legion carried out campaigns with precision and subtlety that others could scarcely comprehend. But the Emperor, watching from Terra, observed every move with quiet apprehension. He could not openly intervene, could not openly restrain his son. Every direct action risked exposing the depth of his fear. And the more Vulcan uncovered, the more the Emperor recognized that his son's understanding was growing exponentially. It was not just knowledge that made Vulcan dangerous, it was judgment. Every decision he made, every action he took, was informed by an awareness of the consequences. While others relied on instinct, loyalty, or orders, Vulcan relied on clarity. And that clarity made him unpredictable in the truest sense. He could not be controlled, because he did not need to be. The shadow of inevitability stretched across the Imperium. Wherever Vulcan's insight touched, the consequences rippled outward, unseen but undeniable. Worlds were stabilized, threats neutralized, rebellions quelled, but in ways that subtly challenged the Emperor's vision. Each act of reasoning, each uncovering of hidden truths, was a reminder that the Emperor's control was not absolute. And in that quiet tension, a realization crystallized: the Emperor's greatest fear was not a battle lost, a planet destroyed, or a son turned traitor. It was the day Vulcan understood the full truth, and acted upon it. Because then, no force in the galaxy could contain him. As the Great Crusade expanded into the farthest reaches of the galaxy, Vulcan's influence grew, not through intimidation or brute force, but through insight. Each campaign, each world brought under the Imperium's banner, revealed more about the structures, secrets, and hidden mechanics of the galaxy, and more about the Emperor's own designs. The Emperor, who had walked for millennia with unmatched confidence, began to notice subtle cracks, not in Vulcan's loyalty, but in the Emperor's assumption of control. While other Primarchs executed orders with unquestioning precision, Vulcan evaluated, analyzed, and occasionally diverged, not to defy, but to preserve what the Emperor believed necessary. Every decision Vulcan made carried the weight of moral reasoning intertwined with strategic genius, and the Emperor understood, with an unspoken dread, that such reasoning could ultimately supersede obedience. This realization weighed heavily upon the Emperor. He had designed his sons to be perfect extensions of himself, weapons to enforce his vision of humanity. Yet here was a son who could comprehend the machinery behind the vision, and, if necessary, change it. The possibility chilled him. For if Vulcan saw the flaws, the unintended consequences, or the moral compromises at the heart of the Emperor's plan, he could act not out of defiance but out of clarity. And clarity, the Emperor knew, was far more dangerous than rebellion. Vulcan's awareness did not stop at strategy or warfare. His mind dissected human institutions, questioned the purpose of the Emperor's unyielding crusade, and pondered the ethics of binding billions of minds under a singular vision. He considered the cost of immortality, the weight of psychic dominance, and the implications of the Emperor's ambition to reshape humanity itself. The Emperor sensed the inevitability of this confrontation long before it could manifest. He had created a galaxy-spanning empire, but the one son who might perceive the consequences of its full execution, Vulcan, was growing in insight faster than any calculation could anticipate. And yet Vulcan remained loyal. He never questioned the Emperor's authority openly. He never challenged the throne directly. Instead, he gathered knowledge, sharpened understanding, and weighed the scales of morality against the weight of empire. That combination, the unyielding clarity coupled with perfect loyalty, was precisely what the Emperor feared most. For the Emperor, power without insight could be guided. Obedience without perception could be harnessed. Even rebellion could be foreseen, confronted, or contained. But a mind that sees, judges, and acts with reason cannot be easily predicted or controlled. And that mind, Vulcan's mind, was growing, constantly analyzing, learning, and questioning. Across the stars, the Emperor continued his plans, but now with a quiet vigilance. Every decree, every campaign, every decision involving Vulcan was measured not for immediate success but for long-term consequence. He understood that the Primarch he feared most might one day act not out of ambition, not out of vengeance but out of truth. And when that day came, the Emperor knew, there would be no turning it back. The culmination of the Emperor's dread was never a single battle or confrontation. It was the ever-present possibility that Vulcan, the son he had forged, nurtured, and sent across the galaxy, would one day see the Imperium in its entirety and understand its fragile, flawed foundation. It was the knowledge that a mind capable of perfect insight might act not in defiance but in inevitable judgment. Vulcan's journey had always been one of understanding, not conquest. His legion reflected his mind, disciplined, precise, and fearless in seeking truth. Each world they touched, each mystery they unraveled, only reinforced the Emperor's quiet fear. For all the power at the Emperor's disposal, there was no control over insight, no containment for clarity. And Vulcan possessed both in unprecedented measure. The Emperor had feared rebellion, treachery, and corruption among his sons. But Vulcan was none of these. His loyalty was unshakable, his respect for life and reason was unyielding. And yet, paradoxically, this made him more dangerous than any traitor, more formidable than any enemy the Imperium could face. Because true fear is not inspired by violence. It is inspired by inevitability. By the understanding that even the greatest power in the galaxy could be rendered meaningless if confronted with the perfect mind, tempered by conscience, and guided by insight. In the quiet moments, when the Emperor reflected upon the Great Crusade and the sons he had created, he acknowledged a truth he could never speak aloud. The one Primarch he feared most was not defined by what he might do, but by what he could understand.